So now in this section, we're going to talk about some of the other forms of inheritance because not all traits are two allele genes with simple dominance, because of course not, because nature is always more complicated, isn't it? So one of the things that can happen is something we call incomplete dominance. And Mendel was actually very lucky that he didn't come across any incomplete dominance. Every trait that he looked at ended up being simple dominance, which is interesting, or maybe he just didn't pay attention to things that didn't go the way he wanted them to, which is not good science, by the way. Okay, but in incomplete dominance, we have three possible phenotypes. Remember, in simple dominance, we only have two. In incomplete dominance, the dominant allele is not completely dominant over the recessive allele. And so one of these is size in dogs, and obviously size in dogs is way more complicated than this, because if you breed two Great Danes together, you get a big giant Great Dane no matter what. So it's more complicated than this, but so here we have a genotype I, or sorry, the allele I confers largeness, the allele B confers smallness. So a homozygous I dog is going to be really, really big, and a homozygous B dog is going to be very, very small. The genotype, the heterozygous genotype with one I and one B, is a medium-sized dog. How cool is that? Now, if this were just that, then you would, when you bred medium-sized dogs together, you would get some big dogs and some little dogs out of the litter, but we don't, so it's more complicated. Anyway, by the way, all domestic dogs are the same species and can all breed together. So yeah, I don't know, there's logistics involved that blow my mind. But anyway, any of these dogs can breed together. Yeah, okay. Anyway, so that's incomplete dominance, where the heterozygotes show a mixed phenotype or a phenotype that's halfway between the two extremes. Another form is codominance, and this is where no one allele is dominant over another allele. So here's some flowers, and in this example, red is dominant and white is recessive. Okay, so you get a dominant red gene and a recessive white gene. And these, if it were just the red and the white, we would expect, if we crossbred them, we would get 3 reds and a white in the second generation. In the case of a codominant gene, we see the red and the white both expressed in the individual. In incomplete dominance, we see the heterozygote is somewhere between the red and the white. Okay, it's pink. So spotted is codominant, pink is incomplete. So what does that mean for a spotted cat? Okay, well, actually there's 2 genes that make white spots on, one that makes white spots on cat and one that makes color. Okay, like I said, it's always complicated. But the allele for the gene for black and brown color shows codominance. So this cat is a heterozygote with the alleles for both black and brown coat color. And so when those are present, they are both expressed. Now you're going to ask me, why is it splotchy and why is there white? Well, there's another gene for whether the fur has color or not. So in the areas where the gene for not color gets expressed, the cat is white. So in order for the black or the brown to be expressed, you have to have the other gene for color also being expressed. Like I said, complicated. We're going to come back to calico cats in another lecture and talk more about how this happens. Okay, and then here's its adorable little kitten that just got the black. So it got the spottiness, but it didn't get the brown. Okay, so this is a homozygous for brown coat color. Cool, right? This, by the way, is called a tuxedo cat when it's black and white. All right, so then we get to this meme, which is Dad's wearing a horizontal stripe, Mom's wearing a vertical stripe, and the kid is wearing plaid. And the caption is, oh, that's how genetics works. So is this how genetics works? Well, it's definitely not a case of simple dominance. Because if it were simple dominance, then either of these shirt phenotypes would be present. Okay, also, clothes aren't genetic. Okay, but just go with me on this one, all right? So since we're seeing both horizontal stripes and vertical stripes here, it's definitely not simple dominance. And here's the thing about this. I think this is really interesting because you could make an argument that this shows either incomplete dominance or codominance. It could be codominance because we're seeing the horizontal and the vertical. But since we're seeing them both all over the shirt, then that doesn't suggest codominance, because codominance we tend to see spots, either one or the other in a certain area. So this is most likely incomplete dominance because we are seeing both the horizontal and the vertical stripes expressed in the same place at the same time, much like red and white make pink. Ta-da! How fun is that? Okay, I thought it was cool. All right. Anyway, so inheritance can be very complicated, and many of the things that we think of as single gene, like eye color, it turns out are multiple gene. And I was trying to find out, like, okay, so how many genes? Turns out there are 15 genes at least implicated in eye color. It's so freaking complicated. All right. Now let's get a little more complicated and talk about human blood types, which are an example of what we call mixed dominance. Also, a really cool study in how the immune system works. So let's talk about a couple of things first. This is what your red blood cells look like. They're sort of roundish and they're smushy in the middle. So they're bigger on the sides and small and shorter in the middle, sort of like you took a jelly donut and smushed the center, the jelly out of it, okay? All right. Some people's red blood cells have something on the surface which is called an antigen. Now you remember gen means to create, so it's creating, anti meaning against. So it's creating something against itself. An antigen is something that your immune system responds to. Why would your own cells have something that your immune system responds to? Well, your immune system doesn't respond to the antigens on your red blood cells. There are two different kinds of antigens, and we call them A and B. In addition, your blood has lots of antibodies in it, and antibodies are these proteins with this really specific shape. One end binds to a white blood cell, and then it makes this Y shape, and the two ends of the Y, the top of the Y, bind to a specific antigen. Each antibody binds to a specific antigen. And that's the way your immune system deals with pathogens, or something that could cause sickness, that you've experienced before. It creates antibodies after your first exposure to it, and then on second exposure, those antibodies are already available to bind to the antigen and then bind to white blood cells so that the white blood cells can break down whatever binds to the antibody. Okay? All right, so that's what those are. So we have 4 human blood types. And type A has A antigens, which are shown round, and B antibodies, which are triangular. Type B blood has triangular antigens and round antibodies. So these antibodies won't bind to the B cells, but they would bind to A. Now, type AB blood has both kinds of antigens and no antibodies. Type O blood has no antigens, but it has both kinds of antibodies. And this is why you can't mix blood types, okay? Because if you put type AB red blood cells in somebody with type O blood, the the antibodies are going to bind to the antigens on the red blood cells and actually clump the red blood cells together, which is really bad for blood flowing through your veins. It just, stops. Okay, from a genetic point of view, this is really interesting because A and B, you see, are both present. So A and B are codominant to each other. But A and B are both dominant to O. So if you have type A blood, you could either have the genotype AA or AO. Same with B. If you have the blood type B, you could have the genotype BB or BO. For type AB blood, you have to have the genotype AB. For type O blood, you have to have the genotype OO, which is the recessive genotype. It's homozygous recessive, okay? Because O is recessive to both A and B. If either A or B are present, then A and B are expressed. How cool is that? How complicated? Why so complicated? Okay, now one other thing I want to bring up, first of all, if you can give blood, please give blood. There are a lot of things, and you can go on the Red Cross website and find out what things would eliminate you from being able to give blood. But if you can give blood, please do. People rely on blood from donors when they need blood from surgery or from an injury or something. And we can make lots of things in a lab, but we cannot make red blood cells. It's one thing that we have not been able to do. So we cannot grow red blood cells in a lab, partly because red blood cells don't have a nucleus. So you have to make the red blood cells from some other cell, and you have to keep doing that. You can't make a red blood cell and then have it make more of itself, okay? Because it doesn't have a nucleus, it can't do mitosis. So if you can give blood, please do give blood. Now, when you may have heard that type O donors are the universal blood donors, and that's actually not correct. Type O is the universal red blood cell donors, because you can give type O red blood cells to anyone because they don't have antigens. So there's nothing for antibodies to bind to. But if you give type O whole blood to someone with another blood type, that person is going to die. Do I have the thing? Oh, no. Oh, here it is. Okay. So this is what happens. Here is a donor with type A blood and a recipient with type B blood. So if you put the A blood into something with A, there's nothing for the antibodies to bind to, no problem. If you put the A blood into somebody with type B blood, then their antibodies bind to two of these at a time, and then another antibody could bind over here and bind with more, and it clumps up or agglutinates, stops flowing through their blood vessels, and they die. All right, but here's the cool thing. If you have AB blood, then you are the universal blood plasma donor, and your plasma is very valuable because it doesn't have antibodies to interfere with any red blood cells, and so they can give your plasma to anyone. So when you donate blood, they actually separate your blood into the red blood cells, the white blood cells separately, and then the blood plasma, which is the fluid part of the blood, mostly water with other stuff dissolved in it, like antibodies. So please do give blood, and all blood types are valuable. Type O, particularly valuable because they can give the red blood cells to anyone. Type AB, very valuable because they can give the plasma to anyone. You've also heard of positive and negative, and you're probably wondering about that. That is conferred by yet another gene. It is another type. If you're positive, you have antigens. If you're negative, you have no antigens and no antibodies unless you've been exposed to positive blood, in which case your blood will start making antibodies, and that most often happens to a pregnant woman during pregnancy if the fetus is positive and she's negative. we now have drugs to prevent the mother's body from making antibodies, but it can be fatal to the fetus if the second pregnancy, for reasons that we don't understand why it doesn't affect the first, but for the second pregnancy, if mom has antibodies, they can bind to the fetus's blood and kill the fetus. Okay, so complicated, right? Mixed dominance, simple dominance of positive, negative. Now, I mentioned multi-gene traits. There are also many traits that are conferred by one gene that creates multiple traits in a person. This is called pleiotropy. Pleiotropy is where one gene causes many different traits. An example of this is this condition called Marfan syndrome, which is where a mutation of a single gene causes a wide variety of traits all over the body, including very long hands and feet, long facial features. People with Marfan disease are usually very, very tall. All their long bones grow very, very long. They may also be nearsighted. They may have scoliosis, which is a lateral curvature of the spine. And often their hearts are malformed. All of these traits are related to connective tissues in the body not developing correctly, which includes bone, cartilage, ligaments, and tendons. So all of those things don't develop correctly because they all develop from the same kinds of cells. So one mutation in one gene causes this syndrome, which has wide-ranging effects. And a lot of people with Marfan disease die fairly young from heart attacks because their heart is not formed correctly and doesn't have enough connective tissue in it, and so their hearts are very weak. Polygenic traits are also complex traits, and these are determined by more than one gene. So hair and skin color are determined by multiple genes. Some of those show simple dominance. Some of those show incomplete dominance. Some of those can combine in different ways. So, for example, hair color in humans, darker colors are dominant over lighter colors. So black is dominant over blonde, but there's incomplete because you could have light brown hair. Oh, it's very complicated. Height is many genes go into that, and then eye color as well. Like I said, 15 genes so far identified with that. Now, one other thing, and height in humans is especially not just genetic, but also environmental, because how tall you grow is going to depend on how much nutrition you got as a child. If you got lots of proteins and fats and lots of energy and all the proteins that you need to build bone and muscle, then you'll grow taller than someone with the same genes who was malnourished as a child. And we can see other environmental effects in other animals. And one of the really clear traits is gene expression in Siamese cats. Siamese cats have a coat color gene that is expressed in cooler temperatures. So the areas of the cat that are colder, such as the ears, the face, the tail, and the paws, have darker fur, and the areas closer to the main part of the body, which is closer to body temperature, are lighter color because the coat color depends on cooler temperature to be expressed. All right, so that is your introduction to inheritance. It's the basics of it are simple. It can be very complicated, so just keep that in mind. We have these things like environmental effects, multigenic traits, pleiotropy, as well as incomplete dominance and codominance. We will do an exercise where we look at some simple dominance traits because it's just easier to do Punnett squares when things have simple dominance. All right, and up next we're going to start talking about genetics, and or more about genetics, and we're going to talk about some really cool genetic engineering, genetically modified food, and how those things are done.